So here in the app class, first, let's look at the mounting phase. I'm going to add a constructor. And because we have added a constructor here, we need to call the constructor of the parent class using super. So here we have a constructor. Let's do a simple console.log app constructor. This constructor, as you have learned before, is called only once when an instance of a class is created. This is a great opportunity for initializing the properties in that instance. For example, one common use case is to set the state based on the props that we receive from the outside. For example, we can set this.state to this.props.something. So here in the constructor, we set the state directly. We don't call this.setState. In fact, if we do that, we will get an error because this method can only be called when a component is rendered and placed in the DOM. So if you need to set the state directly, you can do so in constructor. Also note that here, we won't have access to this.props unless we pass props as a parameter to this constructor and also pass it to the constructor of the base class. Otherwise, this.props will return undefined. Let me show you. So temporarily, I'm going to comment out this line and log this.props here. Here in the console, you can see our constructor is called and our props object is an empty object. But if you forget to add the props to this constructor, we won't be able to access it. So to recap, the constructor is called once and it's the right place to initialize the properties in this class. Now let's remove this.props from here. The second lifecycle hooks we're going to look at is component did mount. Component did mount. This method is called after our component is rendered into the DOM, and it's the perfect place to make AJAX calls to get data from the server. So we can do an AJAX call and then call the set state with new data. For example, in our Vidna application, later in the future, we're going to get the list of movies from the server and then pass that list to our set state method, something like this. For now, we don't have to worry about this. Let's do a simple console.log app mounted. And the third lifecycle hook in the mounting phase we're going to look at is the render method, which we have seen before. Let's just add a console.log app rendered. Now, back in the console, look at the order in which these methods are called. First, we have the constructor, then the component is rendered, which basically returns a React element that represents our virtual DOM. Now React gets that virtual DOM and render it in the actual browser DOM. And then our component is mounted. So when a component is mounted, that means that component is in the DOM. And once again, this is the right place to make AJAX calls and get the data from the server. Now, one thing you need to know about the rendered method is that when a component is rendered, all its children are also rendered recursively. Let me show you. So here in our app component, look at our render method. Here we have a navbar and a counters component. So let's go to our navbar component. Here we have a stateless functional component. In the body of this function, before our return statement, let's do a console.log and display navbar rendered. Now, one thing you need to notice here is that you cannot use lifecycle hooks in stateless functional components because here we have a single function that returns the output of this component. So if you need to use lifecycle hooks, you can only use class components. Now, let's go to our counters component. Once again, here in the render method, I want to add a console.log with a message like counters rendered. And the last part, let's go to our counter component, do the same here in the render method, and change the message to counter rendered. Now let's go back to the console. As you can see, first the constructor of our app component is called, and then our app component and all its children are rendered recursively. So we have app, navbar, counters, and 4 instances of the counter component. And finally, at this point, our app is mounted and is in the DOM. So this is our mounting phase.